All right, hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson here. This is the Cold War in Europe. This is for our unit or the unit, the Cold War.
Our objectives and standards to explain the purpose of the Truman Doctrine and summarize the impact of the Berlin airlift, Take a moment there to read the standards, please. Desired result, how did the Cold War in Europe escalate? So please think about that during the lesson.
Okay, Truman and his doctrine. The Soviet influence in Greece and Turkey was growing. Great Britain attempted to contain the spread of communism, but was facing economic hardship from the war still. They asked the United States to assist. 1947, President Truman, whose picture you see up in the top right-hand corner, asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid for Greece and Turkey.
Truman also stated that the United States should support people around the world in their resistance against outside influences, and this will soon become known as the Truman Doctrine. Congress will agree with Truman and his policy, and with the money and aid to Greece and Turkey, Soviet influence in the area diminished. So rebuilding Europe. Western Europe had been destroyed during World War II. Obviously, as you can imagine, you've seen some of the pictures already we've talked about in class and other lessons about the devastation from the bombings and just the war in general. And millions of people were suffering and from homelessness and from starvation. Now, the European governments struggled for solutions to their problems. And finally, in June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the U.S. provide aid to any European nation requiring it. So the plan. This was called the Marshall Plan after Secretary of State George Marshall, and 16 countries would receive. Sorry, I should say receive. They would receive around 13 billion aid, and this would help bring Europe back from the edge of disaster, because Europe and many countries, including France and Great Britain, were pretty much on the verge of collapse because of the war. So this will definitely help Europe recover. And there's a picture of President Truman signing the Marshall Plan. Now, trouble over Berlin. Stalin closed off highway and railway access to West Berlin. Remember that the Germany was divided into different sections, and Berlin was also divided into different sections as well. So the Soviets had closed off access to West Berlin. West Berlin had been divided up among the Americans, the British, and the French, but surrounded by the Soviets. Now, due to this, no food or fuel could reach the residents of the city. The people of West Berlin only had enough resources to actually support them for a few weeks. So the Americans and the British decided to take action, and what they do is they come up with the airlift. They started the Berlin Airlift, which dropped food and supplies to the people of West Berlin. Now, West Berlin will be able to survive thanks to the Berlin Airlift, and you'll get a chance to read a personal story about the Berlin Airlift and someone who was involved in it during the Achieve 3000 article tomorrow. And in 1949, finally, the Soviets removed the blockade of highways and railways. So here's a picture here of some children and others. You can see them standing on the rubble still, which we talked about the Marshall Plan. This is in Berlin. You can see them standing on the rubble from the kind of results of World War II, and they're waving to, I'm not sure if that's an American or a British plane, but either way, this is a result of the Berlin Airlift. So they would drop things like medical supplies, clothing, food, candy, anything that they felt the people in Berlin could use. Now, there's going to also be an organization for defense. The Berlin situation made many realize the threat of Soviet aggression. So Western European nations joined the United States and Canada to start NATO. Now NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, still around today, and it is a mutual defense alliance. So what they do is they pledge to support any country that will be attacked. Now, the Russians will also come up, or I guess I should say the Soviets, will also come up with their own version of this called the Warsaw Pact, which will involve themselves and other communist nations that they have as a result of NATO. So they will kind of form their own and state that they are doing it for mutual defense as well. All right. So your closure question here, how did the Cold War in Europe escalate? Think about some of the events, think about the Marshall Plan, how that played into it, especially with Greece and Turkey. Excuse me. Think about the Soviets closing off West Berlin and the effects of the Berlin airlift, and also NATO and how NATO kind of plays into this as well. All right, I hope you have a good rest of your day or night, and I will talk to you soon.